Hey, welcome back to part 3 of the link shortener series with Laravel 8. Just as a quick reminder, we're going to be using Laravel Breeze and Livewire to build a link shortener with Laravel 8. And we're probably halfway there right now. In the last video, we created the factories and the database seeder we need to sort of speed up development. And in this video, we're going to be going over writing some feature tests that are more Livewire specific, which I think is going to be an interesting topic. As you can see, this is the login page we currently have thanks to Laravel Breeze. I've already just seeded the database, so we can log in with the seeder login info we've specified. This is the dashboard. There's nothing in here. And to be clear, in this episode or this video, we're not going to be actually changing the UI at all. We're just going to be writing tests. And I'd also like to mention that there's a lot of theory around tests. There's feature test, unit test, integration testing, that kind of stuff. I'm going to be writing some very basic feature tests all in one file. I'm not sure if I'm following perfect convention for feature testing, but I just wanted to demonstrate how easy it is to write tests. And I also want to mention that all the tests will fail in this episode. I'll try to go over what I'm writing in each test and why, and then through the rest of the series, we're going to be fixing those tests because that's really what test-driven development is. So we can actually just go over the project here. Nothing's changed in the routes file. Everything is the same. And we can see that we have a link factory here. Of course, you could also go into the GitHub link in the description below and take a look at the source to see all this for yourself. But basically, we're just creating a link with a user ID, a URL, and a slug that's random. And we're going to test this. So first things first, we are going to create a test file. And to do this, first things first, we are going to actually run all the existing tests in the testing suite because Laravel does come with tests. And typically you run /vendor bin PHP unit. And that'll run the whole test suite. And so the first thing I want to do, and you can see there that all the tests passed right out of the box, so there's nothing broken yet, although we're going to intentionally write broken tests. I'm just going to run PHP artisan make test link test. And test created successfully, so we should have a link test file within the test/feature directory, and we do. And within here, we get a basic test file. Now, I hope that the font is big enough for you to see. I'm going to shrink this so it's a little bit easier. We're not going to be moving out of this file at all, so I don't think at least. So I hope that this is visible. Now, the first thing I want to mention is when you're writing tests within Laravel, Laravel provides something called refresh database, which is almost always used in testing. And it's just a trait that we have to make sure it's actually imported, and it is. And what refresh database does is between every single one of our test methods, it'll actually refresh the database. So the database will be the same for each, the starting point of the database will be the same for each and every test. There will be no leftover data from the tests that ran before it. And this is really important to get consistent testing results because as soon as you start adding more testing classes before or after the existing test that you already have, data might be left over and then your test might break on the data that's already in the database. We're also going to write something called a setup method. So a setup method is just a public function setup. It's going to return void, and we have to call the parent here. And I know that probably looks like doesn't make sense, but everything that happens within the setup method will happen before each test is run. And so if I were to create, let's say, a user and a link within the setup method, that means every single test that runs within this file will have a user and a link available for testing purposes. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to create this arrow user is equal to user, and let's make sure that's imported, factory, which is exactly how, it's the same factory syntax that was used in the database seeder file, create. So to be clear, we're going to create a user. We're going to be creating a user with a fake name, fake email, and just some random data here. And the password will be password, but that's kind of irrelevant for the testing because we're not going to be logging in. What we're actually going to be doing is creating a link. So link is equal to link. Let's make sure that's also imported. Factory of user. Let's define a custom method called of user so we could assign this user to this link. Arrow create, and I'll show you what I mean. Within here, I just want to add this arrow user, And now you might be thinking, is this some built-in magic method? It's not. We actually have to create this method on the link factory. So let's go do that. Just define a quick function of user, and this accepts a user. Let's make sure that's imported. I think it is, yep. And this is something new to Laravel 8, so we could return this arrow state, and within here we could set user ID equal to user ID. And this will actually assign this link now through of user. This will actually assign the passed in user ID as the user ID within this link. And so in our tests, when we run the setup method, which will happen again before every single method, every single test method is run, we will have a link that belongs to this user, right? So we have one user and one link that belongs to that user, which is exactly what we need. And I could actually prove this. So if I create a new test, and for those of you who don't know, creating a comment like this above the function will declare it as a test, or you can do test underscore without this comment, and I believe that'll work also, and that'll run that test. And so let's go ahead and see if we could actually output user and link to make sure that we have the correct data being created. So get user and link, and this, of course, this test won't be left in here because it doesn't really make sense, but let's just dd this user, this link, and run that. Let's just run it in terminal here just for simplicity. So I have a user with ID 1, and I have a link down here with user ID 1, which means that the user we created has one link, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So we can remove this now and write an actual test. Now I'm thinking, for the way that I want to design this application, I want there to be 3 Livewire components. I want there to be a creation component, an editing component for editing link data, and also an index component for showing, I don't think I'm going to make a full data table, but I want there to be some sort of Livewire component that will show the data in a table. And so I'm going to create 3 test methods that will actually test whether we see the Livewire component on that page. And again, this won't work because none of our stuff actually exists. But in the upcoming videos through the series, I think the next one, a lot of these tests will start passing. So the first one I'll create is link creation page contains Livewire component. This arrow acting as will make sure that any request we chain onto this will be done as the user we pass in. So in this case, it's this user. This doesn't matter so much. Well, it does matter because the routes we're trying to access are behind an authentication middleware. And so we need to pass in the user to actually be able to get through to these routes. For now, we just need any user, which we've created, to be able to get to the route we will create for this. So this get, and I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that I'm going to name the creation route links.create. And when I go to this route, this is Livewire specific, I want to assert that I see a Livewire component, and I'm going to assume, just following convention, that this component will be called create link. Now, will this pass? Of course not, because that not only does that URL not exist, but that component doesn't exist either. And we could see that route links.create not defined. Let's go on to the next one here and create a similar one for the edit. So we can name this one link editing page contains Livewire component. This acting as this user. And get is obviously a get request. If we were posting, we would use post. Route links.edit, right? And we're going to assert see Livewire. Again, I'm going to guess that the Livewire template will be edit-link, right? This one's a little bit trickier because typically edit routes will need like an ID for route model binding, right? So we're going to pass in this link, and we're going to assert that within Livewire, we're going to have data provided that is equal to that link. So link is equal to this link. If we save that, that also will not pass, obviously. And then the last one, I'm sure you get the idea now, is for the index page. So we can name this one link index page contains Livewire component. The only difference here is that this is probably not going to have a dot index on the end, just following convention. And I'm going to assume again that the name of this will be link table, just based on how I built things before. So these three tests, if I run them, will not pass, none of them, because these routes don't exist. But if I quickly go and just create this route here, I'm sure that the error will change, which I can prove that it's actually doing something. So let me just close this and just create a route. Route get this, and we can do a shorthand function here, and we could return view welcome. I need to throw this on as a name. So links create and name. And if I run this create test again, the error should change. Before it was saying that that route doesn't exist. Let's see what it says now. So it says cannot find Livewire component create link rendered on page. So the error did change, and this makes total sense because we're just returning the welcome view. And of course that component doesn't actually exist. It's not rendered. This makes perfect sense. So these tests do work. Now I'd like to go through and actually test the functionality a bit more that I see being built for this application. Let's just test the basic things first. Can create link with Slug. Now obviously if you haven't watched the previous video where we created migrations, a link has a slug, which is a unique identifier and will be the thing that will be typed in after the domain, so /slug, right? And that will then redirect to the target URL. And we need to be able to create a link with a slug because, well, it's mandatory, it has to be created. So let's first assert that we only have one link in the database, so we can assert that then we then have two. And that'll prove that we have created something. So assert database count, and this will assert the count for the specified table, in our case links, and we want to assert that there's only one, and this one will actually pass because that is true. So if we run this, it passes because we do have one link that we created within our setup method. And then we want to actually create the request through Livewire. Now this won't work because we don't have the component, but let's say we did. So Livewire acting as this user, and this is a testing suite provided by Livewire, which is awesome. Test, and in here we provide the name of the component we're testing, so create links, or create link rather, trying to keep the naming the same. Set, so we want to set the URL property. I'm kind of envisioning that it's going to be called URL, but we shall see. And we want to just pass in a domain. Let's say google.ca. I'm in Canada, so let's do .ca. And then we want to set the slug. And we could set this to test slug. And then we want to call a method that I'm going to guess is going to be called something like save link. Let's just say save link. And that's going to be an action within the component class. And when we call that action, it will literally trigger whatever logic is in there. And we can then assert that it actually does something correctly. And we'll probably want to assert that it redirects to the correct route, which I'm going to guess I'll be redirecting to the links index, right? So that is the actual logic part of the Livewire test, because the important thing to understand in testing is that you basically create your basic assertions up top, do the setup, make the logic do what you want it to do, and then test again that the correct changes have been made, right? So we've tested, we didn't have to set anything up because we have the setup method. We've done our logic, and now we should test what should hypothetically happen in this case. I want to make sure that this is actually imported here. It wasn't. Okay. So I want to assert now that there's two links in the database. I'm not sure if there's a better way to do this, but the way I typically do this is just by using the assert database count, right? And just change this to 2. Now, of course, this won't pass because there's no component like that. But if there was that component and it successfully submitted a new link, that link should be part of the database, and there should be 2 now. So if I go and also test that there is assert database has in the links table, and I want to test that the URL and the slug do actually exist within there. So one of those links has to be the one. So URL slug, and we can now copy those values. So this test is complete. When I run it and the components are created, it'll create a new link, and it'll verify that there's a new link in the database right here. And that link, one of those links at least, is the one we just created. Now this should never match the link created in the setup method because we're generating random URLs, and the slug is a 6-character random string, and this is more than 6. So we can safely assume that our link was created if this passed. Moving on to the next test. We need to test, can we create a link without a custom slug? And so there has to be some functionality within the URL shortener that will allow the creation of a link without a custom slug. In our case, we're going to use a hash ID to encode the ID of the created link and set that as the slug, which is a little bit complex if you don't see the logic, but that's kind of the way I'm kind of envisioning it in my head. And so if we have a link with ID 1 already created because there's already in the database, and we create another one, that'll be ID 2. So we could do the same test that we created above and just set the slug to null, like so. Set this to null. This should still pass because we're not necessarily passing in a slug. And we will then make sure that we are hashing correctly. So hash IDs encode 2. Now we need to actually install this package. We do not have it, right? So let me just create this test and we'll go and do that. I'm going to name it can create link without custom slug. So I typically use this package here. I'm not sure if this is the correct way to go, but it's worked well for me in the past. So I'm just going to grab this command here and make sure that we install it. And we'll have to run the vendor publish. And we'll choose number 11. That's the correct provider. And now we have a hash IDs config file. And within here, you can set whatever data you want and any preferences you need, but there's not that many options. So if you're interested, I'll leave the link to this package below and you can take a look yourself. Actually, looking at it now, it looks like we're going to be using the main connection by default. At least that's what's mentioned in here. So we're going to use the main. Default value for this setting is main. We're going to be using the main connection to hash our IDs, and we want to set a length, and I'm going to just default it to 6. So that's how long our hash is going to be. And so now if we import this, we should be good to go. Grab the facade. And of course, let's just DD2 and see that we're actually hashing something. So let's see if this works. And it does. See, that's a good example of a hash. And so this test is also complete, and we can go on to the next one. Here I want to test like a negative scenario. So cannot create link with non-unique slug. If a link is created with a slug, it's supposed to be, the column in the database is already set to unique, which you would have seen in the video previous to this. And so we can't create a new link with a slug that has already been taken, and we need to test that. So the way I'll do this is by first, naming this cannot create link with non-unique slug. And let's scroll up a little bit so it's easier to see. And let's start by asserting the database count. So links, and it should be 1 because our setup method creates 1. And then within here, let's do the same Livewire call to the create component, except in here, we want to set the slug equal to this arrow link slug, which means it'll literally try to copy the slug from this link and try to create a link with the same slug, and it should fail. And so let's assert that that is the case by just doing this assert database count 1 of links, of the links table. So we're first asserting that links count is 1. There's only 1 record in the links table. After all this is said and done, it should fail. We could actually test that a failure happens more in depth, but I think this is okay. We actually want to assert that the session has errors, and we want to assert that the slug, I guess the slug would have a unique constraint on it. So we want to assert that there is an error for slug, and that error is unique. And of course, it would be because we're passing in a slug that already exists, right? So that test is done. Let's move on. Now we want to test the update functionality, which is a little bit more tricky. So the first one is can update link. And down here, let's just test that we actually can do that. So the first thing to mention is that this is where that setup method comes in really handy, because we already have a link created for every update check. And we can use this arrow link to have data to test with, basically. So the first thing I want to do is assert not equals. And we're going to use this probably, I'd say 3 times because we want to test 3 things. So let's test this link URL, and we can assert that it's not equal to https google.ca. This arrow link slug is not equal to test slug, and this arrow link is enabled, which is the column that dictates whether a link is actually enabled in the database that also was created in the last video. We want to assert that that is not true, right? We could actually assert false, I guess, if we really want to get technical here. So we could assert that that's false. And now we'll go through the typical Livewire action method calling kind of thing. So we want to go acting as this user. We want to test the edit link, I believe I called it up there. We want to pass in the link, which would be this link. And we want to set the same data we did here actually. Slug equal to test slug. And we can set is enabled to true. And we call save link the action. And then we want to assert a redirect. So assert redirect to the route, let's say the index route, so links. And now we want to test that those values have actually changed, which of course they won't because that logic isn't present. But we want to make sure that even though they're not equal here, and this is enabled as false here, we want to make sure that they've actually changed to these values below. So we can copy this and just change this to assert true, this to assert equals, this to assert equals, and now this should pass if the logic is present. And a couple more tests to go. At test, let's try can update link with same slug. This is a common thing that happens in update pages where there needs to be some uniqueness in some of the fields. Let's say you're editing a link with the slug test-slug, like here, and you're submitting the page. You have to make sure that even though you are submitting the page to update other parts of the link, so other columns, that you can still submit the update with a slug that already exists. Okay, so the next one would be at test. We can call this one can update link with same slug. This is a pretty tricky one because on update pages where certain fields need to be unique in the database, if you have a link with the slug, let's say test, and you're only updating the URL and just leaving the test in there, we need to make sure that that record will actually update without the database kind of freaking out. We need to test that that will actually work. And so we're going to just start by, let's call this can update link with same slug. Livewire acting as this user. Let's test the edit dash link like we did previously, and of course because it's the edit page you got to pass in a link, so that would be this arrow link. Within here we want to set the URL to https google.ca like we have been for the entire test file here. We want to also set the slug, and we want to set it to this link slug. Oops. Because we're actually editing the link created in the setup method up top on this file, and we're trying to test that we can still submit and change stuff with the same slug, we need to actually pass that in as the slug, right? And we also need to set is enabled to false. Call save link. And I just want to actually set up the assertion at the top. But before I do that, I want to actually make sure it redirects to the right place. And again, we're just going to assume it's going to the index. Assert redirect to the route links. I can tell this is going to be quite a long video. Testing is pretty involved, but it's actually, believe it or not, it gets to be pretty interesting once you get used to the whole test-driven approach. So I hope you're enjoying this video, and it actually makes a little bit of sense. I want to make sure that we are actually changing values, and of course this is kind of backwards. Let's first assert that these values are correct up top, let's say. So we want to assert that we have updated the URL here and that the slug has not changed, and we don't need to test this. Okay, now that that's done, we can actually go on to the next test. So there's only a couple left, I think, although we could make a lot of tests. There's a lot of like edge cases we could test, but I just wanted to kind of show how this is done. So this test I'm going to call can update link with same slug. This is actually to test for a common thing on update pages where you're updating one of the columns it has a unique constraint in the database. In this case, links, right? So if we're updating a link and we just want to change the URL, the target URL of that link, and we're just using the same slug, well, because of how Livewire works, we're going to still be submitting that slug through our validation, which is going to check that it's unique in the database, and it won't ignore itself, right? So we need to make sure that we can actually ignore it within our logic and make sure that our URL is updated despite our slug technically not being unique on update. And that's going to make a lot more sense when I write the logic of the actual component. But for now, you'll just have to trust the test that I'm going to write, trust that it actually works. First thing I'm going to do is just grab these assertions because we might as well save some time. And I just want to assert that the URL is not equal to google.ca. And I want to assert, we don't actually need to assert this at all. Let's remove that. And we can assert that this doesn't really matter. So let's just go ahead and write the Livewire call, let's call it. So acting as this arrow user, let's test the edit link component, pass in a link here, and that link will be this arrow link. Now here's where it gets interesting. Oops. Let's set the URL property within the component to https google.ca, and let's set the slug to the slug that is already set on this link. So this link slug. And we need to make sure that on submitting this by calling save link, we're going to get a redirect back instead of an error. So we can assume that we'll redirect back to the links index, which will be named just links. And we want to make sure that this assert equals this arrow link URL is actually equal to https google.ca. Now, something I want to note before I continue on, because some of you might run into it, I'm not sure why it happens, but it's good to actually throw a refresh on here. And that'll just refresh the model so you're getting fresh data. Sometimes I get stale data and these actually won't pass, so I'm going to throw these onto all of these, and hopefully that helps and saves someone some time. So, a couple more to go. Let's write a new test for cannot update link with non-unique slug. This is the test that we cannot update a link to use a slug that already exists if it's not the slug of the link we're currently editing. That's really difficult to understand from like a conceptual standpoint. It'll make a lot more sense when we build the UI, like I mentioned before. You'll have to trust me on this. So I'm going to create a new link, and I'm going to set the slug to test slug. Now let's say I want to update the link that I've created in the setup method to use test-slug, right? Well, I can't. I shouldn't be able to, at least, because that slug is taken by another link. And so let's write the call for this, acting as this user test edit link. This is getting pretty repetitive at this point, but this is actually the last update test. And we're going to pass in this arrow link because we want to update the link that we created in our setup method. We want to set the URL equal to https google.ca, although this is not really relevant in this test, I'll include it. I want to set the slug to test-slug, which is the same one that this link uses, right? And we could pass that in dynamically by sort of referencing this link we've created, but I think this is fine. And now I'm going to call save link, assert we have an error for the slug. If the test passes, that means we do actually have an error that this is taken, and we could assume that it is working correctly. So this is a great case for a test. This is pretty important functionality, so this is a really good thing to test. Now, 2 or 3 tests left that are very small, And this is related to the redirect, not Livewire itself. So what I want to test in here is that our redirect route, which we also haven't created yet, actually redirects to the correct places. And I want to make sure that we cannot redirect if the link is not enabled within the database using the isEnabled column. And I also want to test that when we do redirect, that our redirects count in the database is actually incremented. So the way I'm going to do this is just by writing a couple really small tests. So can_redirect, this acting as this user get route redirect, and this arrow link slug. So I want to make sure that acting as the user we've created in our setup method, I can get the redirect route. That's the name I'm going to use for that route. And I'm going to pass in this link slug because we will be route model binding by the slug instead of just like an ID. We're just going to be a little bit more specific. And I want to assert that I get a redirect to this link URL. So by default, the links are enabled. We don't have to actually make sure that the link is enabled for this test. I want to make sure that acting as this user, when I hit this redirect route with this slug that we've created in the setup method, that I actually get a redirect to that URL we've provided in the setup method, in the link that's created within the setup method. So this is a very simple one. Let's say I want to test cannot redirect if link not enabled. So this is a good test to make. If the link is not enabled, we shouldn't be able to redirect to the target, right? So this link, and I'm going to update it, is, oops, this should be in an array. I'm making a database update here. If you're not familiar, false. So I'm setting isEnabled to false, which means this link will not be enabled and it should not redirect. And I want to make sure that I have a test case for that. So this acting as this user get route redirect. This is pretty repetitive as well. This slug. And I want to assert that the status is unauthorized, which I believe is 403. So that's a great test. And one last one. I want to make sure that link redirect count incremented on redirection, on successful redirection. In here, it would be good to actually check that the increment didn't happen because we got a 403. So let's assert equals this link redirect, I believe is the column. Let's go into our migrations and take a look. So create links table, and it is redirects and it defaults to 0. So arrow redirects should equal 0, and now it should equal 1. All right, it actually should equal 0 because we did not redirect, we got a 403. And down here, we need to assert that this is 0. But upon redirection of an enabled link, which we should see return a redirect to the correct URL, we should see this link redirect equal to 1. And so again, none of this will pass, fortunately. The next video will be me creating URLs and controllers, and so they'll start to slowly pass, but the real progress will be when I'm creating the create and edit components and then sort of showing that data. So check out the next video in the series. It's going to get really interesting. I'll show you that these don't actually pass before ending this video. So you see we have 12 total tests, assertions 14, errors 11, and failures 1. So check out the next video in the series. It's going to be really interesting. I hope you enjoyed this one. Testing is a really big, broad topic. If you have questions, leave them below. I'll try to answer them. I don't know everything about it myself. I actually know very little about testing. I just know how to write feature tests within Laravel. But if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.